Within the vertebrates, there are subgroups. And so jawed vertebrates form a group which excludes the jawless fish. The bony fish form an osteichthyan group, which excludes things like sharks. Lungfish with their lungs, and in fossil members, the homologs of bones in their fins that tetrapods have their arms and legs, then forms a group. And 350 million years ago, some of these fish, which already had stout bones in their fins, which already had lungs, which already had some separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the atria of the heart, they then became the first amphibians. Now, amphibians were the only land vertebrates for a while, and included species which could get to be 12 feet long. There was one that was, maybe 30 feet long. But many of these then became extinct in mass extinctions, especially with the evolution of reptiles, birds, and mammals through the years. And so there are only 3 lineages of these ancient amphibians which have survived till today. The one which is least known is a group known as caecilians. So modern amphibians include frogs, salamanders, which I'll go through both of those, and then caecilians. These are legless. The first fossil members did have legs, but these are legless amphibians, and they live in southern continents closer to the equator. And so as the early fossil amphibians evolved, they diversified into lots of lineages. Some fossil lineages had small legs, or actually one group, the aistopods, they lost their legs. But then subsequently, a later group then became legless amphibians. So here are images of caecilians. They're considered to be a biological order made of 10 families and about 200 species. And I have, this video which, goes through some of the families, showing their ranges. Some are only found on specific continents, and some are in danger of extinction. So out of the diversity of amphibians which have lived in the past, there are 3 lineages which survive today, including the caecilians, which are probably the least well known. Frogs are probably the best known amphibian. So I'd like to go not only through frogs in general, but then also frogs found locally in the northeastern United States, and then go in through salamanders. Now, amphibian lungs don't work very well. And so therefore they do a lot of breathing through their skin. And so therefore their skin has to be thin and kept moist, as opposed to then the reptiles, birds, and mammals, which can have scales, feathers, and hair. Also, given that amphibians, the name means a double life, all typically have an aquatic larval form, then they are then more likely to be found in moist environments. So their skin typically needs to be kept moist so they can breathe through it. Their young often develop in water. Often their mating occurs in water. And so while they are tetrapods adapted to life on land, then water often plays an important part in their development. Now, frog tadpoles begin with external gills for the first couple of days and look more like salamander larvae. Salamander larvae tend to be aquatic with external gills, but then after a couple of days, the tadpoles then lose these external gills. Now, amphibians have a variety of conditions under which they live. Many amphibians, frogs, salamanders, come out at night. And so if one wanted to consider, their ecology, then one has to consider that nocturnal aspect to them. Many salamanders burrow underground. And so, once again, when we're trying to imagine the habitats of amphibians, we have to include just the diversity. Many are subterranean, many live in the water for at least part of their life cycle, and many come out at night. So these are considerations. Tadpoles typically then develop in water. And as I'll emphasize, I'm using the word typically because amphibians vary more in their style of reproduction than any other group of vertebrates. So after the first several days where tadpoles tend to be more elongated with external gills, they then become this shape. And they are herbivores where they filter a large amount of water and are primarily feeding on algae, blue-green algae, etc. Now that's interesting because while tadpoles are herbivorous, as the larval form of frogs, all adult frogs are carnivorous. None feed on plants; they all feed on animals. As a result, tadpoles need a very prominent tail because that houses the intestine that they're using to digest this herbivorous material. Whereas frogs, their order is actually titled Anura, without tail, so that adult frogs are tailless. At some point in tadpoles' development, which depends on their species, some frog species don't spend long in the tadpole stage. Others, the larger ones, may spend years. They develop legs, then arms, the tail is reabsorbed, and then they become the adult frogs, which can then come out onto land. And obviously, if you're catching tadpoles at certain times of the year, then you can catch the ones which are in transition as they're slowly developing their legs. Frogs are not only important in and of themselves, but they are very important in food chains. They help to control insect populations. As tadpoles, they are feeding on algae, but then not only do they feed on other organisms, but many organisms feed on them. So many fish, many birds like that heron, many mammals then feed on frogs, and so thus frogs are important not in and of themselves, but also in larger food chains. Now, just as amphibians have a history, there haven't always been amphibians. They evolved from fish, and the first amphibians are kind of transitional between fish and the later forms. Then there are all of these diverse fossil forms which are no longer alive today. From these fossil forms, then by the Triassic period, this would be in the beginning of the age of dinosaurs, there were a few forms which had some of the features of frogs, but not others. So this one, notice it doesn't have the long jumping legs, but it does have a reduced tail. It does have a very frog-like head. And so there were intermediate forms in the Triassic period, which are not yet true frogs, but which had some, but not all of the features of frogs. Because this was around the time that all of the continents were fusing together to form the supercontinent Pangaea, the frogs which evolved at that time, they were then able to spread to all of the continents. Now, frogs today are in a class, a group of vertebrates, a class called amphibia. Within that, we put them in an order, Anura, without tail. And then there are suborders. In the suborders, we have families, genera, and species. And so as we look at the diversity of frogs, we break them into a series of smaller groups. The most primitive group of frogs, and the first group to appear in the fossil record, belong to this suborder. All right, and there are a number of species which survive until today, including a very primitive frog in the American West, which actually has lost its lungs and does all of its breathing through its skin. There is kind of a middle order that has more than 200 modern species, and then the last suborder of frogs to evolve, that is the largest group of frogs, which has the largest families, the largest number of families. And so as we look at frogs, not all frogs are equally related. And so we recognize 3 suborders and then families within each within each suborder. Now, families, we often can see, what parts of the world they, first appeared in and evolved in, because many are limited to certain parts of the world. And so I have a couple of videos. I'll just show you an example or two where it will begin with where the family is known. Some families are large with hundreds of known species. Some families are small with one or two or three. And notice that this family of frogs in pink, that's the only known area where they are found. As I go through this, I think you'll see why certain frogs then are in danger of extinction. This frog species is found here and nowhere else in the world. And so, deforestation there or loss of habitat there could easily then wipe out the entire species. And so just, I would like to, return to the frogs of our area. But I do have a couple of videos which then go through some of the suborders and the families. And you can see that very often families are restricted to different parts of the world. And then often within a family, there are endangered species. And very often the very limited geographic range of an endangered species is one of the reasons that it is endangered. Notice this one only occurs in this region of New Zealand. The frog family Ranidae is one of the more successful families, both in terms of numbers and in its distribution, and would include some of the best recognized frogs, including the frogs very common in the northeastern United States, such as bullfrogs, green frogs, wood frogs, and others. All right, and so there are some species in this family which are critically endangered, but then there are more common, easily recognized species. In our area, for example, there are two large frogs, the bullfrog and the green frog. You can tell the difference because bullfrogs do not have this ridge where green frogs do. So large green frogs look a lot like bullfrogs, but actually have a ridge which you can use to identify them. This then includes pickerel frogs and leopard frogs, which have a distinctive spotting pattern, and wood frogs as well. So in then these videos, I give some information about each species, including that very large species, which is even capable of eating mammals. Bullfrogs can actually get large enough where they can prey on bats flying near water and large fish as well. Bullfrogs have a distinctive call. And then in these videos, in the background, and some of them, you will hear their calls, because if they're mating at night, then the problem is, how does one recognize?
Although bullfrogs usually feed on insects, crustaceans, fish, and bats, bullfrogs typically inhabit.
So in here, I'll have the calls. Any second now. And that way, when they're courting at night, females can approach males of their species. Green frogs are similar to bullfrogs, but they then make a different sound. And so that's a purpose for these mating calls, so that in the dark, when predators are less likely to be able to prey on you, that individuals can find each other, but then also approach the individuals of the correct species. Each species makes a species-specific call. And Ranidae also includes pickerel and leopard frogs, which have a brown spotting pattern. In pickerel frogs, the brown spots tend to be more blockish, while in leopard frogs, they tend to be rounder and more irregular. These would have their own distinctive calls.
The Arctic circle.
Which will come up in just...
They can tolerate cold and are the only frog.
Okay, I'm sorry. But you can
frogs,
hear the calls of each. And then Ranidae also includes wood frogs. Wood frogs are interesting because they can actually freeze, all right? So they can actually be frozen solid at temperatures below 0. And then they can thaw and still be fine. And thus they are the only frog which can be found north of the Arctic Circle. They tend to mate earlier. So in this, not only can you hear the spring peepers, but then the wood frogs here are also making a sound, maybe sounding like what your fingers would make if they rubbed on a wet balloon. And so once again, making the different courtship songs there. Very often, these frogs mate only in a specific time of year, often early in the year so that they can have enough time to develop and become adults before the autumn reaches. And very often they'll mate in what are called vernal pools. So very often in spring, there's more rain, the snow melts, and pools form which are temporary. And you may notice that in spring, that at night, this is where frogs are congregating in mass, like these wood frogs at a vernal pool, to mate. One of the advantages of a vernal pool is that there are no fish. If these frogs were to mate and lay eggs in a lake or a river, not only would there be more predators hunting the adult frogs, but then there would be more predators which could potentially eat the eggs and the larvae. And so here's a very important aquatic habitat, even though it's not an aquatic habitat all year round. And so when one considers a wetland, even if it's not wet all throughout the year, it can still be vital because this is where frogs, will mate, lay their eggs, and the larvae develop. And so, we need to consider, that aspect as well. Here are wood frog eggs underwater in a vernal pool. So you can see that, they are released in mass, and then the adults leave, obviously providing no care for the young. A couple of interesting aspects about this. One is wood frogs are unusual in that algae, green algae, can then associate with the wood frog eggs in what seems to be a symbiosis, a relationship where both organisms benefit. So the algae are producing oxygen as a waste product, which benefits the developing embryos, maybe even some sugar as well, while the developing frog embryo is producing carbon dioxide and nitrogenous waste, which then benefit the algae. And so when you look at wood frog eggs, you can actually see green in the egg masses because of this symbiotic relationship with algae as the frogs develop. So Ranidae is a abundant family of frogs and common in the Northeast United States. And then the same would apply to the family of tree frogs, which is known as Hylidae. So frogs are separated in different orders, different suborders, and then different families. So the tree frogs tend to have adaptations which allow them to scale vertical surfaces, better. With modifications of their digits and others. So they are quite successful all throughout the world, especially in Latin America. Some are in danger of extinction. So that's obviously a concern. When we talk about species, sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the different species. They look so much alike, including in our area, there are gray tree frogs, two different species, which look visually identical, but which differ in the number of chromosomes that they have and the call that they make. And so these frogs
can be common in much of their range.
We'll hear you then. So spring peepers in our area are common. In southern New York, this is where one can find cricket frogs at the very most northern extent of their range. And so, even if a species isn't endangered per se throughout all of its range, it could be diminishing or about to be lost from part of its range. So southern New York is at the northern end of this cricket frog's range, and it's endangered and protected because while it's common enough elsewhere, its range is shrinking, and it may soon no longer be able to be found in the state of New York. So as I had said, here we have gray tree frogs, two different species, very similar in their number of chromosomes, live in our area, and and here you can hear they have a very distinctive call, which we'll see in a second. And so it is a distendable throat patch, which allows them to make this call. So cricket frogs or tree frogs in our area. The two species of gray tree frog are in our area. Once again, one has double the number of chromosomes. So this species seems to have arisen from an accident where there was a chromosomal change. Note that one species has 24 chromosomes, one species has 48. And a small but common frog in our area is the spring peeper, which makes a very distinctive mating call in early spring, which we'll hear in a second. So once again, these are tree frogs in the family Hylidae. There are many families of frogs, including some which include toads. Now, the word toad is the word we use for frogs, which seem to be more adapted for a terrestrial lifestyle. But as such, some toads are not closely related to other toads. So different groups of frogs have adapted to a terrestrial life in different different parts of the world at different times. And so just because two frogs are called toads doesn't necessarily mean that they're closely related or that they form a biological group. So there are different kinds of toads. Some have gone extinct, some are in danger of extinction, even though they live on land. They still go to water to mate and lay their eggs in water, as you can see here with these American toads. Now, the frogs typically practice external fertilization so that males release sperm, females release ova, typically at the same time, and then sperm penetrate the ova outside the body of the female and the water of the pond. So fertilization is occurring externally. And most then larvae form these aquatic tadpoles. But as I had mentioned, amphibians vary in their reproduction more so than any other group of vertebrates. And as such, you can find examples of what's called direct development, even perhaps in some toads, where if the eggs are laid in a moist place, like under a moist log, that the eggs could go directly to an adult toad stage without passing through a tadpole stage. And then there are other variations where the tadpoles can develop on the back of one of the parents, or in the stomach, where the parent protects it that way. And so there are variations in how amphibians reproduce. But here we see mating toads. Their tadpoles will then develop in water, and very often many of them mate at the same time, as you can see here. The other group of amphibians are salamanders. They're more typical in that they have the long tails as their ancestors did. And there are different families of salamander, different regions of the world, and then different ones in our area as well. They can vary. Some remain in water their entire lives. Some can lay their eggs on land in moist areas, and then the young develop straight into an adult salamander without going through an aquatic larval phase. Here you see one salamander which was terrestrial, but then as an adult then returned to the water. And so there are certainly varieties in lifestyle in salamanders and the degree to which they depend on water. Many of the larvae are aquatic, and here you can see aquatic larvae with prominent external gills. But once again, not all salamanders reproduce in that fashion. Now, salamanders form a order of amphibians, and that can then be broken into suborders. And so once again, what we see in biological groups is this nesting of groups where not all members of a group are equally related to each other. So notice here's a larger salamander, which is stouter. That's one family, Ambistomidae, which is different from the more common, more slender salamanders. And so there are different families and suborders. They are distributed in different parts of the world, including some giant salamanders in Asia, which can exceed more than 4 feet in length. So just as we saw with frogs, we can split salamanders into different suborders, 3 suborders, and then different families in each of the suborders. Notice that some of the families may have a restricted distribution. So, certain families may only be found in certain parts of the world, and any family, any species, which then has a very limited distribution, is thus vulnerable to habitat loss. And there are salamanders which are in danger of extinction because of the very narrow range that they have and the threats that they face on in that range. So I have videos which kind of go through examples of both different families of salamanders and examples of endangered species living in only very restricted parts of the world, but then focusing on these salamanders in the Northeast United States, where my students live, just so that they can become more familiar with their local wildlife. I'd like to go through those. Now, salamanders can vary in how they reproduce. Once again, amphibians vary more in their reproduction than any other group. While some salamanders practice external fertilization, most practice internal fertilization, where males can deposit packets of sperm, which then females take into their bodies using their cloacal lips. And so even though there is no penis in male amphibians, that only occurs in reptiles, birds, and mammals, nevertheless, salamanders practice internal fertilization, where sperm fusing with ova occurs inside the body of the female. While many salamanders have aquatic larvae, many don't. and then the larvae can undergo what's called direct development. If the eggs are laid in, say, a moist environment, then one can kind of go through the quote aquatic stage, still while within this moist egg, and then the salamanders can then hatch from the egg as a miniature adult. And so once again, there's variations. Not all pass through an aquatic larval stage. Some salamanders will actually stay aquatic throughout their entire lives. And so there are examples where those gills, which we saw on the larvae, are then kept in throughout their lives, and the adults live underwater. The family Ambistomidae then includes salamanders which are just larger, wider, and in our region includes the spotted and marbled salamanders. These salamanders seem to be suffering in population declines more so than other salamander groups. This next video is an image of one which has kept the gills throughout its entire life. So notice here is an aquatic salamander, which will be aquatic throughout its entire life. And so as we look at dwindling of amphibian populations, and very often they are a group of vertebrates whose populations dwindle faster, these larger salamanders, they are of great concern. The marbled salamanders, one interesting thing about them is that they lay their eggs earlier in autumn, so that their larvae are actually of a considerable size come springtime. And so their larvae could actually then eat the larvae of other salamanders which are younger. So for example, spotted salamanders will mate as usual in early spring. And so the larvae of the marbled salamander might actually then be able to feed on them. Spotted salamanders, like many, will live underground. And so they eat earthworms and aquatic insects. So you would very rarely
spotted salamanders in our area mate in
you would very rarely get a chance to see them. But after the first warm spring rain, they migrate in mass from wherever they spent the winter in a terrestrial environment. And then they migrate to a body of water where they can lay their eggs. Their eggs are interesting because there are green algae which form a symbiotic relationship with their eggs, but also can live within the cells of the salamanders themselves. As far as I know, this is the only vertebrate where there can be, say, algal cells living inside the animal cells here. And the photosynthesis that the algae can do then is a benefit to these embryos as they develop. So when you look at spotted salamander egg masses, they look green, and the algae producing oxygen benefits these the egg masses, and the larvae are producing then carbon dioxide and nitrogenous waste, which can benefit the algae. The spotted salamander larvae, as you'll see in just a second, they have a very prominent external gill. Oh, I guess that's the next video. And so you'll see the spotted salamanders developing these external gills in just a second. After developing in these vernal pools, which may dry up, and so once again they would seek out vernal pools where there would not be, say, fish predators. They would try to mature fast enough that they would be leaving these vernal pools before the vernal pools dry up in summer, and then they would then go onto terrestrial environments. And while many salamanders are nocturnal and can live under leaf litter and logs, then some burrow into deeper soil where they can feed on earthworms and crickets and other insects. And so spotted salamanders would not typically be seen during the remainder of the year because, once again, they would be burrowing deeper in the soil than most do. So that's one family of local salamanders. The family Salamandridae is a second, which in our area only includes one species. It's more diverse elsewhere in the world, like in Eurasia. And in our area, it forms the common newt. Common newts, then they begin their life as an aquatic larvae, but then because the eggs are laid in water, so here you see the adults laying eggs in water, but then they form this red eft stage where they form a terrestrial juvenile. The reason that they're so brightly colored is because their skin is poisonous, and this serves as a warning for predators, allowing the predators to avoid, ingesting this poison, but that also obviously protects the larvae. Here's another species of newt, which is toxic. And then as the common newt reaches then an advanced age, it would then return to the aquatic environment. So the adults are now more dull colored, more of an olive. They would live in the water and they would mate there and lay their eggs for the cycle to begin again. Okay. And so then this is the only member of this salamander family which occurs in our area. Most of the salamander species which occur in our area belong to the family Plethodontidae. And this family is also known as the lungless salamanders. The lungless salamanders get their name because they have no lungs and therefore do all of their breathing through through the skin. So here there's just another video or two on the eastern newt, its juvenile stage, the fact that the adults mate in water. All right, so those are the adults. Notice they're more of an olive color compared to that red eft juvenile phase. And then there are a variety of the final family, the Plethodontids, the lungless salamanders. These salamanders tend to be more slender. All salamanders are carnivorous, so they would be found, under leaf litter and in logs where, they would eat earthworms and aquatic insects. Now, very often salamanders are neglected, but actually there are so many of them. It's just that many of them are burrowing. Some of them only come out at night. And so studies have said, well, let's take, an acre of, say, forest, and let's weigh the mass of the mammals which live here, or the mass of the birds which live here. One could find that the mass of all of the salamanders would actually exceed those of the larger vertebrates. So the importance of salamanders in terms of numbers is often underestimated. And then obviously they play parts in food chains, because then many of the mammals or the birds, etc., would then feed on amphibians such as salamanders. So this video was meant to just kind of overview the diversity of amphibians which exist in the world. I'm showing that they can be classified into groups and subgroups, that many of these have very limited distributions and are therefore in danger of extinction. And then it ended with the amphibians which are native to northeastern United States.